Thank you, Ankun, for sharing. So welcome everybody to our next CAnD3 Lunch and Learn session. Today we will be joined by two wonderful presenters presenting on a presentation titled Creating a Public Resource on a Job Characteristics Dataset for Use with the Health and Retirement Study. Next slide, please. So first off, I would like to acknowledge the generous funding that we received from our partners and to McGill as well, who is hosting CAnD3. Next slide, please. And then I would like to make a brief land acknowledgement here. So, l'Université McGill est sur un emplacement qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre le peuple autochtone, y compris des nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. Nous reconnaissons et remercions les divers peuples autochtones dont les pas ont marqué ce territoire sur lequel les peuples du monde entier se réunissent maintenant. In English now, McGill University is on the land which has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked the territory on which people of the world now gather. So thank you all for this. And now, without further ado, we can turn to the next slide. This is just a very brief slide about the Q&A rules of engagement. So if you have a question, please put your question in the chat box anytime during the presentation, or raise your hand during the Q&A segment after the presentations. And then at which point, when prompted, please briefly introduce yourself, such as by stating your name and institutional affiliation before stating your question. And so now for the next slide, I have the pleasure of introduce our speakers today. So first off, we have Dawn CARR, who is the director of the Claude Pepper Center and an associate professor at Florida State University in the Department of Sociology. CARR is a leader in the field of aging, and her research focuses on understanding the factors that bolster older adults' ability to remain healthy and active as long as possible. Next, we have our second speaker today, Rebecca Carpenter, who is a third-year doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology at Florida State University. Her research explores how work and other social factors shape health and well-being outcomes, such as financial security over the life course. So thank you both for coming here, and I will give the floor to both of you.
Thank you so much. I will go ahead and start sharing our slides. Okay, does that look okay? So we're really delighted to be here to talk about this project. And I'll just mention Rebecca is has been a doctoral student for 3 years. Is this your third year?
Yes.
Yeah. It feels like she's been here forever and it just started at the same time. But so Rebecca started by working on this project. So she's been a critical player, and as much as I'm going to start off the talk and give you some feedback on kind of the framing and the background, it's important to mention that Rebecca is the expert on how all of this was done and was the primary person making this project come to fruition. So I'm really grateful to be a part of it. I also want to acknowledge the other members of our team. Amanda Soniga is going to be giving a presentation on the Health and Retirement Study and does work for the Health and Retirement Study at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. So we're actually not going to spend as much time talking about the Health and Retirement Study, since she'll be providing more about that. But she's been a critical player and is our partner in this. I was hoping she might be able to drop in and participate a little bit in case she has some questions that you could answer as well. Brooke Helby McFall was also a critical player at the start of this. She's now left academia, but remains a friend of the project. And then other participants in this project include our postdoc, Katie Cow, and but I just heard that. Okay, I guess it's Rebecca. And then I also wanted to just mention the Department of Labor, the US Department of Labor, the person who helped kind of usher along and create the data collection for which we're going to be talking about today, over the last several decades was very generous with her time and helped provide guidance so that we could provide a very thoughtful interpretation of the data set that we're doing. We also had an advisory board that was along for the ride and who are experts in the field. And I don't want to go into all of them, but there's a lot of individuals who've helped with us. So what we're hoping today to do is to just give you a little bit of background on older workers and kind of research on occupations in case this isn't an area you know lots about. And we can, of course, answer more questions about that afterwards. But we'll just set the stage with some real basic information and then talk a little bit about how surveys measure occupations today, and then how that has then led to the introduction of this ONET linkage project that we're going to spend the majority of our time talking about today. After we provide some information about the ONET linkage project, then we're going to provide an example of this and sort of ways that we might use the ONET measures in research, just to give you a sense of kind of the tangible way this might work in real life with your research. And then last, we'll just have a brief discussion on the ways these data are beneficial and helpful for informing social policy in general. So just starting off with some background, I think a lot of people don't really think of the workforce in terms of older people, but about or nearly 1 in 5 older workers in the US, I don't actually have the numbers for Canada and some other places. Oh, I guess I do actually. It's even higher. Thank you for that, Rebecca. She provided those data for us. So approximately 1/3 of workers are 55 and older in the Canadian market. So we're actually talking about a large percentage of the people who are working are in this older age group. And so our work has been increasingly to pay attention to this particular segment of the labor force and the work that we've been doing. It continues to be the fastest growing segment with population aging, which I know you've heard lots about. But the other factor here is that our work lives shape our health and well-being across our lives. We spend a lot of time for people who study health, thinking about health behaviors and factors like education, which we'll talk about as being critical to how our lives kind of play out and our well-being over time. But our work lifestyles, as we sort of like want to call this our work lifestyles, are often overlooked as something that really do function often passively as health behaviors. So in recent years, there's also been important changes in work and retirement pathways. So just to kind of think about our work lives, people often think, okay, the first part of our life is about education, and then we go on to work, and then we retire, as though these are very clean sort of separate periods of the life course. But in fact, these things overlap quite a bit. And for those of you who are doctoral candidates, you know, you're getting education, but then you're also working at the same time. So that's an easy thing to see, but we kind of move in between these things, and particularly in later life, there's this kind of shift that's occurring where we don't often, or actually less than half of workers now since 2008, leave work and never return. So most people, over half, over 50%, after they retire, come back to work in some capacity, either part-time or full-time, or maybe in some sort of consulting role. And so as we think about older workers and our occupational life course, we need to be thinking not just in terms of full-time work, but then this transition over time. So there's a growing value of older workers as important components of human capital generally. And what I mean by that is that as the population ages and people move into retirement ages, where we used to say, oh, we have so many young workers, we got to make room for them. There has been, you know, those of us who study aging are aware that actually there's going to be a time, and now is the time, by the way, where we're starting to see concerns about loss of knowledge and information about a lot of organizations as people retire, and certain occupational subgroups are particularly vulnerable to this issue. So older workers are becoming an increasingly important part of the drive and the kind of the outputs in the labor force. And there's a lot of literature talking about the fact that we can't treat them all the same. Older workers have different needs than younger workers, and we have different goals. Our goals when we're younger is to sort of figure out pathways to move up the ladder and make more money and take on more challenges and suffer sometimes with the goal of being able to get to a place that's kind of further up the line and climb the ladder. Whereas when we're often towards the end of our careers, especially after we've reached that traditional kind of retirement age, we're more likely to be looking for jobs that may not be even lateral, they might even be a step down in terms of pay and some other factors because our goals shift and we're interested in flexibility, meaningful work, the kinds of tasks that often involve things like mentorship. And we don't always want to work full time. And so this is also an important part of the scholarship in this area. So as we kind of shift our attention to the study of work itself, there's a lot of work that's been done to try to look at the relevance of work. So people will say, oh, let's look at the extent to which these outcomes are related to work. And as a researcher, I'm often told, well, you should control for occupation. And what that often means for a lot of people is, oh, you should have some category that says what type of job you're in. And when you're doing working with big longitudinal data sets or cross-sectional data sets, we might have a measure of like 17 job categories. And the idea of controlling for occupation or industry often looks like just kind of figuring out a way to combine all those in a meaningful way. If you can control for if somebody's in service or some other type of work, which really isn't always a way that is easy to figure out and often is pretty coarse. Other ways that we've measured or controlled for the type of work people do is simply by controlling for level of education, with the assumption that lower levels of education are associated with more physical or maybe unpleasant work tasks, whereas people with higher levels are engaged in sort of more white collar jobs or sometimes categorized in that way. But these are both really quite coarse ways of measuring where they don't capture the real kinds of work that people are engaging in and doesn't get at the kinds of tasks and activities and environments that people are in. And then the last issue is often related to subjective measurement. So including the Health and Retirement Study, which is a commonly used data set for the study of older workers, because it was in fact designed to study older workers, they have included only about 15 years into that study, measures about work, saying, how do you feel about your work in these ways? How do you feel about your coworkers? How do you feel about your supervisor? And although these are really useful things, the challenge here is that when you're in a job, it's very hard to imagine a world where you're in a job that's really very different from you. You might have stereotypes about what other people's jobs are like, or you might just know a lot about people who are in jobs that are more similar to yours. And so typically when we make subjective statements about our work, it's relative to what we expect that other people are doing and what it could be if we were doing something else. So let's talk a little bit more about the ways that these measures are included in data sets. So the objectively measured occupational characteristics that are included are usually defined on factors that can be compared across all types of work. So if we're looking at occupational characteristics rather than job title, we're actually looking at things that every job might have available to them. And I'll give you an example just to kind of to think about this a little bit. It might be, how creative is your work? And how important is creativity in your work, for example? And you might think about that, but if you have a consistent measure across every job, having a sort of baseline where this particular measure is being compared gives this sort of standardization so that it's possible to compare across all different kinds of work, regardless of your job title, specifically, broad, I should say coarse, broad, a job category that we previously would say, we're actually able to get into those detailed occupational characteristics. And this allows us to then not just look at one thing, but actually get into things like, what are the characteristics of that job, the tasks, the exposures that you have, when you're at your job and things like that. So I'm going to actually turn this discussion now over to Rebecca, who's going to get into kind of the last part of this description because she knows it extremely well. And then she's going to kind of move towards the way this connects to the ONET project in particular.
Yes, so one of the most important things to this project is kind of understanding how jobs or titles and jobs and occupations are characterized in the US. So in the US, there are two standard federal classification systems for measuring industries and occupations. The first is the North American Industry Classification System, and the second is the Standard Occupational Classification. And both of these are work-related classification systems that are updated regularly to capture kind of how industries and jobs change over time in the US. So a lot of, so the SOC classification system particularly groups occupations according to the nature of their work that is performed within that job, within jobs. And the census occupational classification is derived from the SOC system to create census occupational codes and categories that appear in US microdata and population-based surveys that researchers often use. So for example, if you use like the American Community Survey or the current population, so CPS, you often see census occupational codes as the designated like classification system for occupations in the US. Next slide, please. Yes. Okay, so there are generally two standardized surveys in the US in which occupational characteristics are collected and then released for public use. The first survey is the Occupational Requirement Survey, or the ORS, and this survey is conducted by the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics in agreement with the Social Security Administration. And the second survey, which is the one that we have utilized in our data linkage project, is the Occupational Information Network, or ONET for short, which is developed under the sponsorship of the U.S. Department of Labor, particularly the Employment and Training Administration. So to the public, the ONET is promoted as a tool for job search and career development, but over the last decade or so, it has also become super useful for researchers as it contains a multitude of measures related to occupational characteristics, such as things like work activities, skills, work context, which Dawn kind of was alluding to. And the current version of ONET contains information about occupations since 2003 and up to now, and it is actually routinely updated to capture changes related to work over time. And prior to the current version of ONET, ONET actually replaced the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, so DOT data. And so now the ONET is kind of what they've been using, they've collected data over time for it. And so that's what we use for our project. And there are kind of different data collection strategies when comparing the ONET to the ORS. So data for the ORS is a survey of establishments in private industry and state and local governments. But for the ONET, they actually use a two-stage sampling design. So first is a statistically random sample of businesses expected to employ workers in the targeted occupation. Once that is identified, then a random sample of workers within those occupations and businesses are selected. And the new data is collected by surveying these what they call job incumbents and using standardized questionnaires. And then occupational analysts also update this new information for occupations using the updated information from the survey of job incumbent workers. So next, I'm just going to kind of do like a high-level overview of our ONET linkage project that we've been working on. I think first, Dawn is going to talk really about the goals of the project and how we kind of came to where we are today.
Sorry, took me a minute to find my mute button. So I thought it might be helpful just to give you an idea, because sometimes your ideas about what science is important comes from different kinds of social networks. So you have this great group of people that are involved in CAND3, and these might be colleagues you have for life. And this project has been a long time in coming. Early efforts to say, we need to measure occupations better. We really need to do some work to make this available for science to be better on the study of occupations. And these conversations started happening with some of my colleagues at the University of Michigan quite a long time ago, starting with a small project I did when I was at Stanford before I was at Florida State, with the former director of the Health and Retirement Study, who introduced me to some of these early versions of this linkage. There weren't very many measures, it wasn't very refined, but it was my first time going, holy cow, this has all kinds of potential. And so for several years after that, I would go to our annual professional meeting and run into the folks involved, including and especially Amanda Soniga, who you'll meet again in May. But and we would have these kind of bounce ideas back and forth. And so we had talked about different strategies, about ways to move forward, but we knew it would be a big undertaking to create these data sets and make them available to the public. And it's not something that you're rewarded for sometimes in academic work. And so we knew we were going to need funding and some other efforts. So she had the idea of first saying, well, let's get together everyone who's tried to use these data in the back. And so we had a meeting of experts in the summer of 2020, got some great ideas, and based on some of those discussions, started our work just getting started saying, let's figure out what kinds of things we need. And then we leveraged that group of experts as kind of a panel to lean on as we made our decisions, and also to sort of get their blessing of sorts to be able to say, these are the strategies we think we're going to use so that you all can take advantage of a singular approach. Because what had been happening up until that point is a whole bunch of individual people had been saying, ONET seems like a useful way to study occupations, and they'd go off on their own and try to figure out one strategy for one study, and then another person would take a different strategy for using these data. And you'll see in a minute when Rebecca walks through this why this is important, because there's a lot of decisions that need to be made, and when they're all different in people's approach, we don't have kind of a standardized approach. And often it's without feedback from people like the Department of Labor, who created the data sets in particular, or to kind of give us some guidance on how were you thinking about this? What do these mean? So really what we saw this was as a gift to the field, a service to the field, to create a data set that every researcher could use that would have consistency in the decision making and could lead to higher quality outputs, more refinement, something that could be updated over time, so people could rely on that. So with that, I think we're just going to go a little too far there, right into then the kind of steps in which kind of we took to get to this, so that we can explain how it looks. Rebecca?
Yeah, so this project has kind of gone on over the last 2.5 years, and the data products in which we've recently published kind of were created and done in 4 steps. So first, we created and developed a crosswalk, like Don was talking about, kind of a standardized crosswalk that we used vetting and validation measures that linked the ONET SOC taxonomy, which includes the ONET data, to the Census Occupational Classification System, which is used in the surveys in which a lot of population-based surveys and a lot of people use, so like the Health and Retirement Study or the American Community Survey. And then our second step was we kind of we discussed and had a careful selection of ONET measures that we thought would be useful to researchers interested in understanding how work and occupational characteristics and context shape the health and well-being of individuals and groups over the life course. And then the next kind of step was the actual creation of the data products based on the measures that we wanted to include, as well as our crosswalk. And then we just recently released the data products to the public. So we actually created a pre-linked ONET Census Health and Retirement Study data files linked to the HRS surveys for 2004 to 2016. And this is actually available through restricted access in the HRS enclave. So this is already pre-linked and ready to go. So people who would like to use this data can actually go ahead and use it. They don't have to link it to any survey themselves. It's already ready to go for the survey years listed here. And then we also we released a publicly available data set which we call the FSU U of M ONET census data on the Claude Pepper website, which I will show a little bit later. And this is actually raw data that researchers can go ahead and link to any survey in which they use detailed census occupational codes. Yes, next slide. So the most important factor related to this project was actually the development of the crosswalk that linked the ONET taxonomy to the census classification system. Our main goal, like Dawn was kind of alluding to earlier, was to produce a publicly available high quality crosswalk that other researchers could vet as well as use. This is especially important because there was really no consensus on the crosswalk or linkage techniques used in previous research. And essentially, researchers were all developing and using their own crosswalk and linkage techniques when conducting their studies. And this made the research process quite time consuming, and it was difficult to replicate these results across studies and surveys because everybody was kind of using different linkage techniques. And for our project, we actually, as Dawn was kind of talking about, we worked with a panel of experts, including an ONET and Department of Labor staff to engage in this careful vetting process that we believe ensured the highest level of efficacy and lowest likelihood of missing data problems related to our crosswalk and data linkage. So kind of when talking about this, the first question people think, especially if you've never really dealt with occupational crosswalks, is what is an occupational crosswalk and what does it really allow us to do? So a crosswalk allows us to match occupational codes from one occupational classification system to occupational codes in a corresponding system. So in this case, we were linking the ONET codes to that taxonomy to the census taxonomy. And it really just allows us to link and connect data across different classification systems that can be used in different surveys. And really, it also allows us to link occupations and occupational data over time because federal governments update their occupations over time because there's an emergence of new occupations and the disappearance of old occupations. These crosswalks really allow us to understand and see how certain occupations expand and grow into new ones or they disappear. So for example, software developers is a kind of an occupation that has developed over the last couple years, the last couple decades, where telephone operators is actually an occupation that's disappearing now. And so those are kind of just some basic examples in which you can see why it's really important to understand the changing nature of occupations over time. So again, we needed a crosswalk for this current project because the ONET database provides detailed occupation data for over 1,000 occupations. However, many of the nationally represented data sets that we use in the US actually measures respondent occupations at the census occupational level. And this pretty much means that the ONET system is quite detailed compared to the SOC and the census classification systems. So for example, the 2019 ONET system, which is the taxonomy, which is the most up-to-date taxonomy, currently has 1,016 occupations, where the 2018 SOC taxonomy really only has 687 or 867, and the 2010 census occupational system has 539 occupations, and that 2010 system is actually a census system is kind of actually what is used in survey data today. So we decided through this project, we decided to build 3 different crosswalks and data products that were derived from the 2000, 2006, and 2019 ONET taxonomies. Our rationale for this decision was to attempt to capture changes in job classifications over time so that researchers could utilize ONET data in longitudinal studies to see how exposures to work environments and things like that really impacts people's lives and well-being. So as part of this project, we kind of assume that data derived from the 2000 ONET taxonomy is representative of jobs in the early 2000s, and that data derived from the 2006 taxonomy is representative of jobs in the mid-2000s, and that data derived from the 2019 taxonomy is kind of representative of jobs since 2010 until now. So here's just an example. This is kind of just an example of one of the crosswalks that we use to kind of help build our larger crosswalk. So this is the ONET SOC 2019 taxonomy, and then the 2018 SOC taxonomy. Here you see kind of how much more detailed the ONET taxonomy is here. So you see that chief executives and chief sustainability officers in the ONET taxonomy actually linked to the same SOC occupational code, which is just chief executives in the 2018 taxonomy. And this is kind of really just an example of how the ONET taxonomy is more detailed than the SOC and corresponding census taxonomy. And it really kind of emphasizes the difficulty that researchers had connecting ONET data to SOC and census occupational codes. So now I'm going to talk briefly just about how we developed our crosswalks for the project. So the first, again, like I said earlier, we developed 3 different crosswalks to link the 2000, 2006, and 2019 ONET taxonomy to both 2000 census codes as well as 2010 census codes. So the first kind of crosswalk we did is what we call the 5.0 crosswalk, which is ONET 5.0 data. So we first took the 2000 ONET SOC classification system, and we crosswalked that to the 2000 SOC classification system using crosswalks published by ONET as well as like the Bureau of Labor Statistics for the US. And then we then link that to the 2000 census classification system, which is what you find in survey data. And then we also did the same thing for the 2006 ONET classification system, which then linked that system to the 2000 ONET SOC classification system, and then to the 2000 SOC, and then the 2000 census. And then lastly, we also linked the 2019 ONET system to 2010 census codes by using crosswalks that link to the 2008 SOC system and the 2010 SOC system, which were then linked to the 2000 census system. Okay, so once we crosswalked and linked the ONET occupational codes to the census occupational codes, we made some decisions, like I was saying, about what measures we wanted to include in our final data products. So ONET includes measures for a variety of domains, not limited to what is shown here on the screen. However, we decided to produce linked measures for the work domains in which we thought researchers would be most interested in, and for the work domains that were easily linkable. So for example, ONET collects information on types of technologies used within each occupation. However, it was very difficult to link these measures at the census occupational level because the responses were qualitative and categorical, therefore making it really difficult to collapse based on the census code or link these kind of quantitatively and having a quantitative measure for these. So these are the 9 different domains in which we have data for across our different data products. These include knowledge, skills, abilities, work values, occupational interests, work activities, work contexts, work styles, and job zones. And for each of these, I provided kind of just an example of what kind of measures or items are available for each of these 9 domains and how many items are available total for each of the domains.
And I'll just add to that that when we say items, we mean variables. So you'd have one variable that says to what degree or how important, which she's going to talk a little bit about, does this job require, include knowledge about chemistry, for example. And so then they receive a score from 1 to 5. So you can explain that a little better, but I just want to clarify, if you add all these up, these are all individual measures that you would use in your own data.
Yes. Like Dawn was saying, we kind of provide a variety of different measures, including mean scores, medians, sample size for how many like job incumbents were surveyed for each of these specific items or variables. And then for some dimensions, 2 types of values were actually calculated as well. One is the importance value, which Dawn was kind of alluding to, which is like an importance value for the job characteristic for a given occupation. And then it's kind of defined as the degree to which a particular dimension, so say something like chemistry or mathematics, knowledge about chemistry or mathematics, is important to each occupation. So it's kind of it's a scale. So it ranges from 1, which is not important, to 5, which is extremely important. And then there's also a second value which was calculated, which is the level, and this is defined as the degree to which a particular dimension is required or needed to perform each outcome, and this ranges from 0 to 7. In our process of discussing and collaborating with the experts at ONET, they actually, Pam Frugally, she suggested using importance values over level values because I think they made what is more about logical sense to use, as well as they were very actually similar.
Yeah, for most social science research, importance is really what is most like, they're highly correlated, level and importance, but importance kind of reflects more the intent behind the job itself.
Yes. Okay, next slide, please, Don. And so this is just kind of an example of the work activities domain, which has 41 items. And these are the variables that we have for this domain. So for example, we have mean data values related to each of these items. We have medians, things like that as well. And so this is just kind of an example of the type of variables that are available in our data sets. And so for each of the selected domains, we collapsed the data values for each item or element by the census code. So we used our crosswalk to see what ONET codes are linked to what census codes. And we created mean data values by the census code. Through the crosswalk, we were able to identify cases in which we had a one-to-one match of ONET occupational codes to census occupational codes. So essentially, when one ONET code linked to a single occupational code. In these cases, the data value that was provided for that ONET code was transformed and given for that census code. So when we had those one-to-one matches. In other cases, we had instances in which multiple ONET codes crosswalked to a single census code. So here's an example of this. You see here that 3 ONET codes, financial managers, treasurers, and controllers, and investment fund managers all linked to the same 2010 census code. So when this occurred, we took the mean data values of these ONET codes and now transformed that and put that, gave that to that is now the new value, mean data value for the census occupational code. So the last step, in which is kind of new over the last couple months or so, is we've released this data to the public. So again, there's 2 ways in which we've released to the public. The first is on the Health and Retirement Studies website. So it's already linked to longitudinal data that can be accessed via enclave approval, which is you just go to the HRS website and there's a form to fill out about your project. Overview, you have to sign, I think, a couple confidentiality agreements and security agreements and things like that. But once you have access, you can actually utilize this data in the enclave and it's ready to go. And it's already linked to HRS data. And then you can link that to a variety of other HRS data that anything you would like to use in that way. And then the second public release, again, is the public release on the Claude Pepper website. And this includes ONET data sets and information for you. So we have like our data description files and things like that. And this can be used with any survey that really uses detailed census, 2000 and 2010 census occupational codes. And so here's just an example where you can, this is the webpage in which you can find access to the HRS ONET data. It gives a brief description of the project overview, and you can, through this webpage, you can actually access and the form in order to gain access to the enclave. And then this is just a screen cap from the Claude Pepper website. And here you can see that you can get the 2000 ONET data, census ONET data, 2010, the 5.0 data, the 10.0 data, and the 26.1 data. And if you follow these links, you get access to the crosswalks, the public crosswalks, the public data, as well as our data description files. So now I'm just going to briefly talk about how you can link this data to other population-based surveys, just very briefly. And really what you do is you download the data from the Claude Pepper website, and then you merge it, you merge that data to survey data as long as it uses the 2000 and 2010 census, detailed census codes, just using, depending on what program you use, just using a simple merge code, and as long as the occupation codes match up, and then you can run your analysis. And again, we recommend using the importance value means in cases in which you have variables for both importance and level, but particularly just any of the value, data value means variables. And so I think Donna is now going to talk about an example in which ONA has been used in previous research.
Yeah, so I thought it might be helpful just to wrap your head around this in a way that could be like a real research project that you might want to think about if you were doing this kind of work. So this is the study I was talking about that I did with the less refined data originally, that now we're hoping to go back and actually recreate these kinds of measures. But this particular study was interested in looking at changes in cognitive function related to retirement. And I have the link here. We had it as your optional reading for today, so I thought it would be helpful to just talk through it a little bit. So with this one, we were thinking about retirement being a potentially, on the one hand, a release from stress. On the other, it was a kind of taking your brain away from what might be cognitively engaging activities during a day. So depending on what people did, it wasn't clear to us whether or not retirement would be good or bad for brains. And there's been some research suggesting retirement is bad for cognitive function, and we wanted to look at that in a couple of different ways. So in this study, we were interested in looking at people who are continuously full-time employed and comparing them to people who fully retired or left work, came back, or just partially retired and stayed in some kind of part-time work. Now we're looking at a 6-year change score for their cognitive function measure. So in terms of the ONAT measures, we did a whole bunch of factor analyses, which is an option, and took data on their pre-retirement work and said, okay, well, we want to figure out what factors we think would be associated with cognitive complexity, because our argument was that we thought engaging in cognitively complex work would be beneficial for cognitive function. So through factor analysis, we identified these 5 items, which are drawn from the context and activities domains of the ONAT files. And then we created a tercile of the scores. So we added them up and created terciles. So it was low, so people were in low, moderate, or high levels of cognitive complexity. And then we looked at their change in cognitive function. What we saw with all the groups was that on average, maintaining full-time work and retiring and returning to work were protective, but if people fully retired or partially retired, they saw major losses. But this varied by level of work complexity, so that people in low complexity jobs before retirement experienced large declines, even if they engaged in post-retirement work, with only maintaining full-time work as protective for cognitive function. But those in high complexity job experienced no differences in losses cognitively, regardless of whether or not they stayed employed or left, with returning to work after a break being associated with actually a small improvement in cognitive function. And although this itself could be an interesting conversation, I just wanted to give you a sense of some of the ways you might think about these measures being leveraged. So these were just 5 items into a single scale that we evaluated in terms of something that we thought was very important. And for the first time, instead of simply saying education is important for cognitive function, which we already know, we were able to say, even net of education, we can see the type of work as being associated with how brains change in association with departure from work. So I thought I might just kind of note, as you think about this, should you be interested in this type of work, it might be useful to think about different ways of leveraging the ONAT measures. One might be to think about a single item. There's these, I don't remember how many variables that you can choose from, over 100. How many is it, Rebecca? You know this, 190 something?
There's like 4,000 depending on contextual measures and stuff. Yeah.
In terms of the mean, but yeah. So there's a lot of measures you could choose from. One might be something that we've been talking about is something like loud noise. So we know that if you're exposed to a lot of loud noises of your career, this can lead to hearing loss, which is associated with higher levels of dementia. And so you might be saying, okay, let's look at exposure to loud noises and see if this particular outcome is of interest. Or you might be interested in something similar to this cognitive complexity measure, where you're interested in looking at combinations of factors, where you might run a factor analysis or use theory to guide a selection of measures for something physical or something like a highly physical job or a highly sedentary job, and be able to create an individual measure. So the last thing I'd mention is that you might think about where in the life course. If you're linking these data to something like the CPS or a longitudinal study in early phases of life, we're giving examples of later phases because we're studying older workers, but it's also important to think maybe what you're doing in early life has implications for later in life. And so you might be thinking about looking at data sets at particular times in the life course and thinking about which phase matters to be able to evaluate these periods. And the last thing I'll mention is there's already been some efforts to link the ONET to country level classifications of labor force categories in other countries. And we haven't heard of any that have done this with Canada, for example, but there's certainly the ability to do that. So if there are people interested, we'd certainly be willing and interested in talking to you and seeing if we could provide some technical supports for those interested.
I will say, I believe in the last couple months, there's actually a crosswalk that was published to the ONET website that links the ONET occupation classification system to, I believe it's called the European Skills, Competencies, Qualifications, and Occupation, like this occupational dictionary, so like ESCO. And so there's been efforts in that manner. And then there's also been some studies that have linked ONET measures to data to other studies, like international studies, like the German study on aging, cognition, and dementia in primary care patients.
So the last thing we'll just mention here is just how we think this is, just sort of thinking about why using measures like ONET might be important for studying policy. Workforce policy is an increasingly important thing, and having data that moves beyond these first measures and allows us to look at heterogeneity is really important, especially as we're thinking about the value of older workers to the labor force and their role in providing human capital in the labor force. So these are potentially important for lots of reasons, but one thing in particular is thinking about ways the work environment might need to change, things that might need to be modified to decrease likelihood of becoming disabled and being unable to work, and a whole variety of other factors that lead older workers to maybe not be able to participate in the ways that we need them to looking ahead. It's also important to think about our work environments in ways that are like our health behaviors. We're spending sometimes 8, 9, 10 hours a day engaging in activities, and we don't even consider those sometimes as much as we do what we're doing when we get home after a long day of work in terms of lifestyle behavior. So thinking about work as a lifestyle and as a health behavior might be a way to kind of rethink how we're studying these kinds of things. So we know that with increases in longevity, we're going to have longer working lives over time. That's a whole other conversation about how long we should be working, how long we can be working. But there's also this reverse notion, which is longevity is in part predicted by the kind of work that we're doing as well. And so being able to think about the length of our work lives and the extent of our work lives influence the length of our lives is an important part of the conversation. And last, there are important implications of kind of working more years on well-being. And we don't really necessarily know what recommendations to be making. So people often say we want to work as long as we can. We want to get as much productivity out of people as we can, but maybe this is very much dependent on the kind of work we're doing. Maybe some people should be working longer. Some people need to transition, by a certain age so they can be protective of their health and well-being. Some maybe would be better off in part-time situations, and others maybe really need to be stopping work before retirement ages, and figuring out what those variations look like for people in different types of occupations is important, and we need these kind of data to make those decisions. So with that, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
So thank you both so much for this wonderful presentation. I will now open up the Q&A for our participants. For those of you who came in slightly later, my name is Michaela, and I will be the moderator for this Q&A session. So in the meantime, before we have any questions that are through a microphone, we already received 2 questions in the chat. So I will read these over to you. First question was, do we need ethics approval using the HRS or your data?
Yes, not for our data. You actually can just access that directly from the website, download it. It comes in an Excel format that can be then transformed to any data set. For the HRS, she's actually on here now, I think, Amanda Soniga, who's going to be doing the description of how do you get HRS enclave approval in her talk in May. So you'll get lots of details about that. But yes, there is a requirement of an IRB approval through your institution that would have to be submitted, and she'll go into the nuts and bolts of that. But yes, it's not a quick, you can just download the data. There is a little bit of a process, and access does take a bit of time. You should think about at least probably whatever your timeline is for your IRB to go through, and then maybe a week or so after that's been accepted, there's usually the ability to set it up in your machine.
Excellent. Well, we have another question in the chat for now. The question is asking whether linking ONET measures to different countries, when linking ONET measures to different countries, do you consider it if the country is developed or developing?
Well, we haven't done this work ourselves. We focused entirely on the US, just like Americans always do. We like to think only about ourselves in our own context. I think the people that have made efforts to do this have primarily been working in countries that are fairly similar in terms of their occupational environments as what we see here in the US. So these are European countries. This recent one with someone that we connected with when we gave a workshop on this in November. I believe there will be one in Mexico. That's probably the country with maybe the least in common with the US relative to the others that we've talked about. Germany and the EU are a little bit more similar in many ways, but I don't think there's been efforts by any others to look at more developing countries and those kinds of work environments. But it could be that needs to be its own project, and it could be a mix of older versions of ONET and newer ones to be able to look at kind of which jobs are prominent there.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Sagi in the...
Hi, so it's not exactly a question. I just wanted to sort of, what's the word, like bolster Dawn and Rebecca's recommendation to sort of use ONET in other countries' contexts. Me and a co-author currently use it for a number of kind of different papers within a project, and we've sort of expanded it to look at labor market outcomes in the UK and Canada. And it really is a rich data set to sort of add to your kind of existing work. So I wanted to highly recommend it, and also mention that if anyone, so we had to do manual crosswalks of both to ONET and of the occupation codes like over time. And so if anyone else is interested in expanding this work to Canada and the UK, feel free to reach out so you don't have to start from scratch when it comes to the crosswalks. But I was very excited to hear that you guys have been doing like really strong crosswalk work in the US, because it really does take a lot of the work out of for researchers.
Amazing that you're doing that. So if there is interest ever in sharing any of that, I'd be more than happy to maybe make some kind of references on the Claude Pepper website if you'd like people to point to any versions of crosswalks or anything else. Maybe we need to add that as here's useful links for other ways to learn more about this. So certainly would be very happy to talk to you about that if you want to make that available to others.
We have another question in the chat. Nick, would you like to read out your question, or would you like me to do it on your behalf?
I can do it. So it's kind of a two-part question. I really love the measure of cognitive complexity that you use. I've used need for cognition before, which is not exactly what you're using it in this scenario, but I'm curious if you think that you could adapt like a scale like need for cognition, capturing a respondent's cognitive complexity and adapting it to the workplace. So how often do you feel that you're seeking out complexity in your day-to-day life at work? And then secondly, have you considered occupational prestige as a potential variable in this process as well?
Yeah, so interestingly, HRS also does have a measure for need for cognition. I believe it's in the psychosocial and leave behind questionnaire. I think they have a 5-item version. It's probably, I assume, similar to the one that you have, and if that's one you were using from the GSS. This is actually interesting. Obviously, they're very different. One's subjective, which is what we're talking about. This is useful in certain ways, but then the ONET is an objective measure of the jobs, regardless of their experiences within the jobs. But what you could do in theory, let's say, okay, what about the score on an individual's need for cognition versus how that predictive of the kind of job characteristics that they actually have? And you might be able to look at sort of whether or not there's a high correlation with high levels of cognitive complexity and need for cognition, and see if this is better for them. So it might be the case that there's out of sync. You want a job that uses your brain a lot, or you have a high need for cognition, and you're not in one. You might find that there's a problem there. In terms of occupational prestige, I've never used that. Rebecca, do you have some background in that area? I feel like you might be better at speaking to that.
Yeah, I haven't really used occupational prestige in a manner that like relates to these types of questions. I do know that there is like sociological work that does look at occupational prestige and kind of labor market outcomes, but that is something that I think would be interesting to embed into understanding how not only does prestige matter, but also kind of quote unquote job quality and how it impacts different well-being and health outcomes.
Yeah, and I do know some folks who do a lot of work with occupational prestige, and that is, I think that would be a really nice thing to compare and kind of link these together as well. So maybe we can give you some more papers if you want. Maybe we should just sit and just give you more papers for you to write. I feel like you've got two. These are great ideas. I love the idea of connecting what factors kind of link to these two other concepts that you've looked at before. It's great. And I don't know whether the GSS has a version that has detailed census code, because it would be cool to link those together too.
Awesome. Thank you both so much for your insight. This was great. Awesome.
Love your question.
Well, thank you so much. We have room for maybe one more question if anybody has any burning questions. If not, we're almost at time. So I would like to thank you both very, very much for coming here to speak with us today. We have one last slide to share here, which is inviting you all to come and join us for our next CAnD3 Lunch and Learn event on April 12th, titled "Are We Adding Life to Our Years? Testing a Compression of Morbidity Argument by Examining Activity Limiting Pain in Older Adults Using Multi-State Life Table Methods." So this will be a talk by Dr. Zachary Zimmer. That's it from me for today, and thank you so much. So I would like to invite you both to stay on the same Zoom link, and we'll be joined by the fellows for the Meet the Speaker event.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.